Linux Luddites, episode 60, for the 1st of November, 2015. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Paddy.
And I'm Jesse. Now, has anyone wondered about writing their own operating system from scratch? Well, in this show, we divulge and digest your feedback before we interview Lukas F. Hartmann, who has done just that. He's the sole writer of Interim OS, which is an operating system reminiscent of the simple 8-bit personal computers of the 80s, and it can run on the Raspberry Pi 2, and is now open to community contribution. And while Paddy and I both sound very well, and Joe will do for the interview, things aren't quite as happy at the moment, are they, Joe?
No, I've got man flu, I'm afraid, but I'm soldiering on.
That's the spirit, Joe. Let's soldier on, let's get on with it.
So unusually then, let's start with the feedback. And first of all, a huge thanks to Christian Tizard for your PayPal donation and to Galen White for becoming a new monthly supporter and also for highlighting a bug on our website, which Paddy is somewhat fixed now, hopefully.
Somewhat. Hopefully it's sorted, yeah. Thanks, Galen.
And of course to our existing monthly supporters, it's very much appreciated, guys.
It really is. Thank you, everybody, very much indeed.
And we haven't mentioned it for a while, but we've got the DigitalOcean affiliate link, which is where you can support us. So if you're looking for Linux hosting with root access where you can do pretty much anything you want and spin it up for a few minutes or a few hours or use it as a permanent host like we do, then check out DigitalOcean. And if you go to linuxluddites.com/DigitalOcean and sign up via that affiliate link, then once you've spent a certain amount of money, we get a little bit of a kickback from that. And it's not cost you anything extra. So we use them and we're happy with them. So maybe you will be too, so check them out.
So whilst I was on my extended hiatus from the show, one of the topics you guys covered was the Sarah Sharp issue. And we got a fair amount of feedback on that.
Yeah, so in no particular order, kicking off with Keith Zubot-Gebhardt. He says, I've never seen Linus make comments which were not really deserved. And there's a rather large deficit of examples where recipients of a vitriol seem actually displeased with how things played out. It mostly seems to come down to others vividly describing some sort of terrible culture, but then half-heartedly pointing towards examples they can't really defend as illustrations of their point if pressed, and they often refuse to engage in dialogue on the matter anyways. Some quotes sound unfairly personal as clips, but rarely seem anything other than perhaps playful hyperbolic when the full context is read. I'm reminded of when Leonard Pottering suddenly loudly declared that he would no longer post on the LKML because Linus's attitude was so rotten compared to that of the System D camp, and he linked to one of Linus's rants at Kay Sievers. Thing is, Kay in that thread was trying to duck responsibility for something, and it was almost inarguably for the best, especially because he was then convinced to accept a fixed, that he was told off by Linus. And Kay, later in that same thread, made exactly the same kind of disparaging joke while interacting with someone else. It should be noted that Kay is one of the Red Hat folks involved closely with System D and related projects, and worked and continues to work with Leonard just fine apparently. Matthew Garrett signing off the LKML and theoretically forking the kernel in response here isn't too surprising, since he seems to be friends with Sarah Sharp. Both replace comments they dislike on their blogs with fart, which seems a bit immature of people decrying others for lowering the level of professionalism and discourse.
Well, I think we're probably just going to rattle through these and then perhaps reflect on them at the end. So continuing on with Endro Greenidge, who said, this is a sad, shallow debate. As a black male professional in America, I've dealt with some truly vile people. But my answer was, and is, to focus on doing a better job. It works. Doing a superior job is the only way to highlight the problem. Sometimes what we think of as personal attacks are just comments on our poor performance, and sometimes it's truly bias. Consistently doing superior work will give one the confidence needed to grow a spine and push back. Yes, you too can. Cultivate some confidence from being better than the rest.
And Lynn Dixon said, there's a difference between saying something like, your performance here stunk, versus your performance here stunk, but that's to be expected from insert sexist, racist, homophobic, whatever slur. Also, why do we presume that maintaining an atmosphere of aggressive language and behaviour is creating the best product?
Yes, this is a point on which Matthew Platt expanded, saying there's also a difference between your performance, and on we go, and here's why this piece of code is suboptimal.
Now, just going back to Lynn's point there about the sexist, racist and homophobic stuff. Now, I've heard a lot of people make mention of this, but I personally have not seen anyone link to a specific Linux kernel mailing list post that includes any of that stuff. I've seen plenty of kind of bashing of code and personal insults to a degree, but I've not seen any of that. So I asked in the Google Plus community, can someone please link to that? And I didn't see anyone. So have either of you two seen that, any specific examples of that?
No, I can't say I have. I think the point you're making is fair in that the sort of bashing that's been going on has been almost sort of between friends. And yes, if you take it out of context, it can look like someone is maybe being offensive to someone if they didn't know them. But when you know someone very well and you've worked with them for a number of years, which clearly Linux and Linus has, then you would get to know the joviality between each other, and there would be humorous interpersonal sort of jibes and things. And so I think that's maybe the difference, is that if you take it out of context, like they were saying, it looks bad, but as it is, it's just friends chatting about things. And I haven't seen, to answer your question, any sort of racist or sexual or sort of slurs that have been highlighted on the Linux kernel mailing list.
Yeah, I think you're talking about banter. I think that's how it'd be described. I guess the problem, which we may come back to in some more of these comments, is people choose to take offence or don't choose to take offence. And there's a lot of folks out there who make that decision, unfortunately, in one certain direction. Anyway, Wan, posting on the website, said, I just pulled my headphones out in anger when you, Joe, accused Sarah Sharp of being attention-seeking. That was incredibly ignorant of privilege, demeaning, and indeed childish, or at least extremely tone-deaf. Having listened on, thanks to Andrew and Jesse for pointing out some of what was wrong with that, and to Joe for stating he changed his mind. As others have said as well, the more talented people are made to feel welcome in FLOSS communities, the more and better free code will be written. But also, there is just fundamentally inherent value to behaving like decent people and building social institutions that are inclusive and non-discriminatory.
And Will replied to one and said, I think Joe might have taken the stance he did early on in the discussion, in part to play devil's advocate and generate discussion. I don't think the viewpoint that he was putting forward really applied to the Sharp case, though, since she quietly and reasonably transitioned out of her community roles after publicly calling for change without success, and then posted an explanation on her blog many months later. It hardly seems like a case of someone getting offended once and then publicly quitting to draw attention to herself, without trying to address the problem, which seemed to be the behaviour Joe was criticising. Not really, I'm afraid. Well, not really. I mean, yeah, she transitioned out of her roles well, and that should have been it, as far as I'm concerned. That was the point I was making. That the attention-seeking bit was to make a big song and dance about it, and to the way she worded it, and just the whole thing just seemed like attention-seeking to me. And the thing is, I kind of went back on what I said towards the end of the discussion, mostly to bring it to a halt, to be honest, because it was getting a bit boring, but also because I'm a little bit scared to speak my true feelings about this, in all honesty. And I get the feeling that a lot of people are in the same boat, because I don't want to offend people, because people do seem to be very sensitive about these issues. And you see the phrase social justice warrior thrown around, and, words like privilege. And I don't know, I know that even saying this now is probably going to incite loads of hatred towards me. But, sometimes you just have to take a step back and realize that just because things offend you, it's not the end of the world. You can just move on. And, I think that when it comes to the Linux kernel, if you don't like the culture, then just don't take part. And that's something that we'll get back to.
Yeah, I think this fear it's an interesting thing, though, Joe, because Jesse put a post up on Google Plus about the topic, and there were far, far fewer people replied to that poll than normally do to one of Jesse's polls. And I think a lot of that is that people don't want their opinion to be known, or are frightened of having their opinion known. In a way, isn't that self-censorship just as concerning as any of the abuse or purported abuse that we're discussing here?
I would say so, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, so in that poll, a lot of people were saying that they thought that the way that Sarah Sharp had handled it showed problems with the Linux kernel mailing list, and there were very few votes for the way it works is fine and carry on, and if you can't take it, grow a thicker skin, or that sort of attitude. But you're right, because that poll is open and because everyone can see who's posted which result, then it's very difficult to post if you feel, dare I say it, the sort of negative view, the view that it's fine if you are able to take it, you should, and you should be able to take the criticism and move on. And like you say, it's sort of a banter, and maybe it's banter on the screen rather than in real life, but you should be able to interpret that the right way. So people aren't going to post on there as freely as if it was entirely anonymous. But coming back to the feedback, Nathan D. Smith carried on the topic that Joe mentioned there, saying, Joe, there is a false dichotomy between code is king and people needing to be thick-skinned. As Sarah said, I need communication that is technically brutal but personally respectful.
I think this is at the crux of the whole issue, though, isn't it? Because what people view as personally respectful and how they expect to be treated or would like to be treated varies from individual to individual. And if you've got someone who always wants to be handled with kid gloves and they're not, then they will view that as being personally disrespectful, whereas exactly the same behaviour exhibited towards someone else will be treated in a totally different manner.
Yeah, I keep on thinking back to, from my point of view, doing reports at work and things, when your supervisor or your superior reviews that report, they will always have comments and discussion and additions and changes to be made. And a friend of mine worked in Germany for a couple of years and said that in German there's a clear distinction between personal disrespect or personal changes to be made, let's say, and this report. So regardless of who's written the report being wrong is not any kind of slur on you. It's a slur on the report, and we, for the better, should change these things, and we as a company need to improve this. And it's nothing to tarnish the credit of the person who's written it. And so there's a clear distinction between the business role of writing the report and the person who's written that report. And there's a different language being used within German to define those two roles. Whereas in English, we have it as one thing, don't we? If someone discredits or makes comment on the work you've done, it's very often that people will take it as a slur upon them personally. And so I think we don't have it, and it won't ever appear because English is very much as it is, but there needs to be a way that we need to say this is poor for the Linux kernel, and regardless who've written it, don't take it the wrong way, but there's technically a better way of doing it or an improvement. And not filtering down as a personal slur, and that's sort of, I think, where we're getting this mixture. So we basically need to all adopt German and have a clear distinction between the report or the code and the personal slur.
Didn't that nearly happen once?
Or twice.
Anyway, so finishing up this bit, Jezra speaks sense as usual. And he said, as far as I can tell, the Linux kernel is a software project started by Linus Torvalds, and the Linux kernel mailing list is where discussions of Linus Torvalds' project take place. People may not like how Linus communicates with other developers on the communication channel for Linus's project, but no one should ever tell Linus how to behave when he is discussing the development of his project. How would you feel if someone told you how to behave when recording Linux Luddites? Well, yes, exactly. Exactly, Jezra. Nail on the head as usual. Thank you.
Yeah, I must admit, I've got a huge amount of sympathy for Jezra's opinion there. And it kind of goes back to your poll as well, Jesse, because what appeared to be two totally different viewpoints available as the first and last options on that poll. And I actually agreed with both of them in that the kernel mailing list can be rude, but that's absolutely fine. And as Jezra said, it's Linus's project. The Linux Foundation may have come along and tried to make everything a little bit more corporate and happy-clappy and getting people's money on board, but it's Linus's project, and we need to respect how he wants to run it.
Has Linux become too big from the point of view of having him as the way that he wants to run it, and therefore it should become more corporate? I mean, if, dare I say, he was to win the lottery and just cast his back to the whole Linux project and a new kind of hierarchy was in place, do you feel it would have the same vibe on the Linux kernel mailing list?
I think that's really a rat hole we shouldn't go down because we spent long enough on the topic anyway. But one of the joys of open source software is we don't really have to pose these hypotheticals, because if anyone felt really strongly about this, they could pick up this ball and take it away. It's different from real life, where if you're ever falling out with someone, if you're playing kicker out in the park, there is only one ball. In open source, the code is there. Anyone can pick it up and run with it. And if people reckon they can do a better job than Linus, then good luck to them.
Okay, let's move on then. And Dave Allen got in touch pretty much to gloat that he's got a Steam controller. So do let us know how you get on with that, Dave.
Yeah, let us know how it goes, Dave. We also have some feedback from Robert Horn regarding Chromebooks, and we'll take that on board and look into that. But Lars Falk Peterson commented that we should check out DietPi for our now unusable 4GB cards, which was something I referenced a couple of shows ago. He said, I use it for all my projects. It's a very small install size, lots of adapted software and configs, can automatically set up USB for disk and RAM disk for logs. So it sounds like a really sort of slimmed down version of Raspbian, simply to get onto these smaller cards, which I admitted when we were talking about the new version of Raspbian that no longer fitted on all the SD cards I had. So thank you very much for that, Lars.
Can I ask you guys a question? Because I obviously didn't look at this, but I heard the show and I listened to it with interest. What on earth are they doing including stuff like LibreOffice? I mean, why are you not just getting a bare bones distro for a device like a Pi?
Because they want it to be a good out-of-box experience. For the same reason that it boots to the desktop, for the same reason that security is taking a complete backseat in favor of convenience, they are trying to just make it as new user-friendly as possible and including as much stuff as they can to make it a full-fledged distro. And we spent a long time talking about LibreOffice and whether or not it runs well enough, and perhaps a bit too long. But I think you raise a good question, Paddy, and that's a question that we did try and address. And I don't know. I think that they're just trying to be everything to everyone, and maybe they shouldn't be.
Yeah, I mean, that's what really struck me, because my impression is the primary market for these devices is in education. And I would have thought that within that environment, a teacher would have a set tool chain or something like that as part of the curriculum that they're going to teach the kids. And the fact that it comes up with LibreOffice installed is neither here nor there, because they will actually create bespoke SD cards to actually boot from in the first place, rather than using the out-of-the-box experience that you're talking about.
I don't know. I think that might be giving teachers a bit too much credit, to be honest, that they would be able to make custom installations. I think that most teachers just want to be able to use Nobes or something, and or Win32 disk imager. I don't suppose they're going to be ripping stuff out and DDing things and actually getting down and dirty. I just don't think it really works like that in reality. I mean, obviously there are some very enthusiastic teachers like Kat Lamin who are willing to learn loads about it, but I think the majority of teachers just want to get on with it and don't really know much about this stuff. So I think that's who they're aiming at, really, is just a nice, simple, does everything out of the box experience. Well, John the Nice Guy Spriggs got in touch and kind of set us straight on some of the errors that we made when talking about the TLS, SSL, HTTPS stuff during the last Over a Pint a couple of shows ago. Now, it's kind of a bit too long to go into here, but next time we talk about this stuff, hopefully Paddy will be here and we won't make such errors, because Paddy knows all that stuff anyway. So he'll set us straight. But thanks for that, John, anyway.
Yeah, he did also say he may well do a piece on it at OggCamp. So if it's on the board, I'll put my vote towards that one.
Yeah, as will I. And I'll go along and learn, hopefully.
We're rounding off the feedback then and sticking on the topic of security. Dave Allen got in touch and said, "Hey guys, loved your over a pint last week regarding encryption and the current government's position. This is something that I'm really passionate about and almost changed my vote over last year. During a press conference back in May, David Cameron said, there should be no form of communication that we cannot read. But I bet if at that press conference somebody asked to look at the Prime Minister's phone to read his messages, he would not have got the opportunity. I also bet that the Prime Minister's phone is encrypted. This points to a system where there is one rule for the governing people and another rule for the masses. This sets a precedent towards a dangerous path that we really don't want to go down that has many more implications other than privacy. Not only that, but also, if encryption were to be made illegal, the only people affected would be the good, law-abiding people. Do you really think a terrorist would stop using encryption because it was made illegal?"
Yeah, absolutely. If everyone who was, as you say, law-abiding and by the rules of the government were to stop using encryption, and the various applications that we use, both for email and MMS and communication, had no encryption whatsoever, they would just use that to spot anyone who is using encryption is therefore a ne'er-do-well or a terrorist or someone who's doing something against the system, against the government. So it just comes back to that whole point of that I think we were covering in the show regarding the idea that banning encryption or having encryption with a backdoor doesn't help anyone because the government will see it all and they just use it as a way of putting you into pigeonholes. And if they do that, it doesn't help anyone, really.
And on what other Linux podcast would you hear the phrase ne'er-do-wells?
Okay, well, before we move it on, I'd better give the contact details that I forgot at the beginning. So you can email us, show@linuxluddites.com, or on Twitter, Google+, or Facebook, or you can leave a comment on the website. We're now joined by Lukas F. Hartmann, who is the founder of the German MNT Media and Technology Company and was the technical co-founder of SpaceTech. So welcome, Lukas.
Hi.
So can you tell us a little bit about MNT Media and Technology then?
MNT is basically my little company that offers IT services, basically, software development and now integrated hardware development, prototyping, stuff like that. I sometimes include a few friends if the job requires. So it's basically my freelancing thing getting a bit more professional.
Okay, and so what's SpaceTech then?
SpaceTech is more like a classical, what you would call startup company, where MNT basically holds some shares of. And it is a web platform for collaboration with a focus now on education. So that's very abstract. Let me tell you what you do. It's basically a whiteboard on the web where you can put all kinds of files and video and audio files and text notes and collect stuff. And teachers use it to prepare content for their classes, and pupils can access the content at home and solve their assignments. And so basically, it's a bit more decentralized way of learning, and also companies use this for like conceptual work and stuff. And it's a web application.
Okay, and you've also written a digital audio workstation.
Yeah, that's more of an experiment because I have a band. I'm working, in a bit in music production as a hobby, and I'm not really happy with the music production software that's available in Linux since about a bit more than a year. I've switched to Linux on the desktop all day, and I do all my work basically on Linux now. And I also try to make music on it, and so far I haven't been very successful with that. So that's why using Apple Logic is, I think, the only thing that I boot OS X for now, sometimes. And of course, I tried Ardour and stuff, but I wasn't, I'm still not very satisfied with the editing comfort, and so I try to because I'm a programmer, I always end up at this point where, okay, I'm frustrated with software X, so let's try my own thing, and and that's produced that my digital audio workstation project for Linux, but it's more in an alpha state. I mean, I tried, I realized some kind of the editing ideas that I had. I also played around with including a Lisp engine in a audio workstation environment, similar to what Emacs or the GIMP does. But yeah, it's a very early prototype stage, this project.
That's a sadly sort of well-known trend that people find there's a particular media thing on Linux which doesn't quite work for them. I think that's a reason that many people have to dual boot. And from your intro, you clearly have many fingers in many pies with M&T medium technology and Space Deck and things. So you're clearly very busy, but that's not actually the area that we've got you on for. So you've written this operating system called Interim OS, and you've got it running on a Raspberry Pi. So can you just give us an introduction to that, please?
Interim was born really out of a talk that I gave also, also around a year ago in a thing called Interface Critique that was hosted here in the University of the Arts in Berlin. And it was, all about interfaces, not only computer interfaces, but general interface. What is an interface? And my talk was a bit about my frustrations with the complexity of modern computing. And because I grew up with home computers, for example, the Commodore 64 or the Sinclair line of computers, ZX81 and so on. And back then it was like, okay, you switch on the computer and it says ready and you have a cursor and you type a program or you load something. And the machine felt very immediately accessible, like its capabilities. And there was, to go back a bit further, it was when I got my first computer, the ZX81, there was no software with it. There was only this tape recorder and the manual that had the basic commands in it and some listings, and I had to type on those listings and then made the software basically by typing in the commands. And I immediately had this feeling that, okay, a computer is something that is programmed and that has some kind of graphics and audio that are and text facilities that are accessible through programming. And computers have evolved away from this interface, obviously, because now they're, I think, mostly used for media consumption and social networking, like text communication on the internet. I think not a lot of people use a computer to program it. Like you could basically deliver a computer nowadays. You could ship with a ROM, and you actually don't need to. You wouldn't need to ever install new software in it. And programming is more and more of an afterthought, or like something very special that you have to install the developer suite, and you have to register and go through some kind of, for example, in Apple world, you have to go through to release an app on iOS. You have to go through the App Store and some kind of censorship mechanisms now to release software. So it's quite detached.
You're talking about the immediacy there as well, Lukas, of how things used to be for those of us that grew up in the 80s and had these 8-bit machines. And it wasn't just on the software side, was it? I mean, at that time, we could actually understand what was going on with the physical hardware.
Exactly. Okay, at first, maybe it wasn't very apparent that how things inside of the computer worked, but you could find out about this also in the manual, or by poking around, you would see what are the limits of this machine actually. And of course, you could open it up and see the chips and see the traces between the chips and understand, okay, these are some kind of memories, and this is the central processor, and this thingy generates the graphics magic and so on. And people could make like homebrew expansion cards. I think for the Commodore computers, there were, you could buy experimenting cards, basically empty expansion boards that you could solder your own stuff on and plug them into. There was a thing called the user port. Can you imagine? A computer having a port that's called the user port, where they said basically, okay, this is where you can expand the system. This kind of spirit, this kind of, I would say maybe spirit of co-creation is lost today. I mean, obviously not completely. Let's not super exaggerate, but it's more and more in the background. And if you buy a computer today and with Windows or something, or buy, for example, an iPad, it is kind of hard to understand how it actually works, what kind of layers are there in the system, how does the thing actually work. And this also applies to a computer that was supposed to be, for education, and the Raspberry Pi, which was, when I first heard about the Raspberry Pi, I thought this is supposed to be a hackable machine. I'm sure it will come with a big handbook, explaining, or PDF explaining like everything in detail, and it wasn't like that at all.
Something that's come up in the feedback from our audience is this idea that phones and tablets are not computers. I mean, you have talked there about computers as just being everything from the laptop that you would know as a computer. I mean, it feels like you've got this disconnect in people's minds that they think that a phone isn't a computer when it clearly is.
Yeah, I mean, you have to see what is the use of a device? Like, what is as an appliance, what are you, it's like, okay, all the things that have a motor are obviously not not all of them are cars, and I think it's going in that direction. Like, you could say everything that has a CPU is a computer. So also your car is also a computer. Your fridges and washing machines are computers. But let's say I found these terms, home computer and personal computer, very interesting. You could still argue, of course, that the iPhone or iPad or whatever tablet or something you have is a personal computer, because it is, it's only for you, it's personal, it stores your information. It's clearly an information and communication processing device. So for me, I would say like smartphones and tablets could definitely count as computers. And I think I don't remember where, but I think yesterday I read some kind of interview with the people who are making in Apple, who are working on the iMac, and internally they say that they also see everything that they make still as computers. Like internally in Apple, like the watch and the iPhone and everything is regarded as a computer.
I think the thing for those of us who look fondly back on the old home computer era really is, it was the sense of empowerment that you could understand what was going on and you could directly control it. And you've touched on those two aspects already in what you've said. And I think that's really what's lacking in a lot of this technology today. Even people running Linux on the desktop, very few people understand how the whole thing is put together. And they certainly don't understand how the actual PC box is put together. They might know how to swap out cards if they want to upgrade it or what have you. But at a board level, they've got no idea whatsoever. And that's lack of empowerment, I think, is what you're getting at, isn't it?
Exactly. It was for me not easy to switch to Linux. I took many attempts. Over the years, I remember, I don't know, I think the first Linux that I ever installed was SUSE 5.0 or something. And I don't even know how many years that must have been ago. And almost every year there would be a day where I thought, okay, now today I'm trying, what is the state of Linux? I will do a kind of an install party at my place. Not really, but you always need to put aside a few hours for this at least. And go somewhere and see, okay, I got to this kind of frustrating point where something breaks. I don't understand what's going on. I'm Googling around. Nobody knows what this weird exception is here, and how does this version of this config file what can you write in it, and so on and so on. And then at some point I always gave up because I never reached the point of productivity. And end of last year, like I think October last year, was the first time where I, with the help of some friends who are really knew how to prevent mistakes, that was the first point where I could actually make the switch. And I think it was only possible because at that point I really had a lot of experience with computers and programming in general already.
So you finished up talking about the Raspberry Pi, your hopes for it, and unfortunately they were dashed. I guess there's no other equivalent out there at the moment then that gives you sort of, I know the Raspberry Pi isn't modern hardware as in its processing power, but it's certainly a new computer, it's come out in the last few years. There's no other option for, let's term it, open hardware that you could use?
There certainly is. Now there's a bunch of boards available, like the Beagle board, QB board, whatever board. I mean, there's really a lot of them. I think the Raspberry Pi is just the most prominent one, like let's say the blockbuster of those boards, and the one that made it into mainstream press, and the one that I could actually buy at my local Media Markt. I don't know what the equivalent would be in the UK, but like that electronics store where you can also buy the dishwashers. They actually had a Raspberry Pi there, one.
Right, yeah.
And so I think the people who make the Raspberry Pi have a mission, and I think it's obvious to me, okay, they operate under certain constraints, like, for example, they want to make it very cheap, which is good. But I think ultimately they should aim for complete transparency in the documentation of this project. Because you actually don't get that documentation book or PDF if you buy the Raspberry Pi. You can download an SD card image, and then you have some kind of Python environment and or Wolfram demo version of a mathematics program and so on. But this is, to me, not very different from the experience that you will have when you just install Linux on your PC.
You're talking about particularly the GPU, the undocumented GPU functions there.
Not only. I mean, it's a system on a chip, and I mean, the Raspberry Pi doesn't ship with a document that says, okay, this is a system on a chip. It has these components inside, and they communicate with each other in this way, and so on and so on. And it's just not the way that it is.
Yeah.
The documentation is like, okay, on your SD card, you have to have a config.txt file. It can take these parameters and maybe some more that we don't document yet. And that is something that I really disliked, actually.
Why did you dislike that?
I think my dislike was inspired actually by an article, I think, or a wiki entry in the Debian, on the Debian website, where the Debian Foundation says, we don't recommend the Raspberry Pi because of the binary blob that you need on the SD card, or the system won't even boot. And then I realized, okay, I thought it was just an ARM board. I thought, okay, you turn it on and there's an ARM CPU, and I can read the ARM manual and it will say what will happen and so on. But that's not the case. If you turn it on, something else has control of the computer, and at some point it decides to give control to the ARM and maybe the code that you can put on your card. And what happens before, you have no idea. And also, this whole supervisor system is running all of the time. And I think I bought the first Raspberry Pi, sorry, I don't really remember, at a time where I was very sensitive to stuff like that because of the whole, okay, there might be a lot of backdoor. I was a bit sensitive to security and so on, like the whole theory that there could be a lot of backdoors in our chips and in our phones and whatnot. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a platform where you could be sure what is going on, especially if it is something that is aimed at an educational market, that you want to show in a school and teach kids like, okay, this is how a computer works, but actually we don't really know what it does here. So, okay, some magic will happen and then we'll turn it. This is not science, you know? So that's my criticism. Of course, I'm not the first one who is criticizing this, and I know why it is like this, because obviously you have some kind of IP problems that they have and some NDAs that they were signed, and of course they cannot just break them. But it would be very nice if someone would make like a truly open core in the future, because if you want to use something for education, you just have to have a documentation, or it's not educating anyone.
But you could argue that it is educating kids, as you say, that they've got Python, Ruby, and now even Java on there. So it is, in terms of an educational tool, valuable to some extent, isn't it?
Yes.
Even if it's not as valuable as it could be.
Exactly. No, I don't want to totally diss the Raspberry Pi. I think it's wonderful that it exists at all, and that it has, I'm sure it is valuable in terms of a trend of, a hackable computer in general is a good thing, and now they showed that there is a big market for this, and that surely made it attractive also for other vendors to jump into this game. And I think it gave really the electronics maker movement also some additional momentum, like the other big platform being the Arduino.
So you've talked about the problems that you have with the Raspberry Pi. Mm-hmm. With Interim OS, you're trying to solve some of the problems with not necessarily the Raspberry Pi, but with modern computing.
Yes. I mean, I don't want to don't want to claim that I am solving all kinds of problems of computing in general. That would be a bit too much, but I learned in the last years, especially, that it is a good thing if you don't have a lot of code. The fewer lines of code you have and the more simple your code base is, the less bugs it has. It's just like that. People make errors and make mistakes, and if you only if you have a smaller code base, there will be less errors in it. And on the other hand, it is really nice to have a small code base because you can wrap your head around it and you can read it and understand it. And I really discovered the value of reading other people's code and understanding through this. And I was inspired by projects, for example, like XV6, which is a complete Unix that is, I think, 70 pages PDF printed or something, the complete source code. And when I saw that, I was thinking, I can read this and then I will understand the complete Unix operating system. Why is then Linux, mainstream Linux distribution installation like a few gigabytes? I didn't understand this disconnect. And I was always overwhelmed by the amount of configuration files and the amount of source files, for example, in the Linux kernel, because I can only keep that much information in my head at a certain time. And Interim is basically my attempt at combining a few things that I saw that have some kind of minimalistic design and put them all together and have an interesting and usable system in very few lines of code, like something that you could read in a few days and understand. And to achieve this, I used some patterns that I found in other systems, of course. And those patterns are, for example, the use of file system everywhere. Like that's an idea from Unix and later Plan 9. And so basically that have a uniform interface to everything in the system, like have the same interface to everything. Like your screen is a file, your keyboard is a file, your mouse is a file, and so on and so on. Everything is just a stream of bytes that you can read or write to. And on the other hand, simplicity comes from the idea that the operating system kernel is the same as a language. So this may sound a bit weird, but it worked very well for Lisp machines that were computers that ran an operating system implemented completely in Lisp. And this idea was also basically enforced by, I didn't understand why all the configuration files in a given Linux distribution are written in different formats. Like, why does everybody invent their own format? Why do I need to have Python, Perl, TCL, C? I don't know, tons of languages here, and I need to understand all their quirks basically to be able to understand my system. And I thought, okay, if we just decide for the most simple to implement language and use it just for everything, for the configuration and for the programming and for the shell, then surely it will be, I can implement this in much less code. And yeah, that's basically worked out. And I chose the Essex versions of Lisp for this because they were basically the most simple thing that I could find, that I could understand and felt comfortable in.
So you call it Interim OS. Presumably that's because there's something to come after it then.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because I know that I don't have the funding or whatever to create a new fully fledged operating system. I don't have the resources, so this is a bit like an experiment, a placeholder, or something that shows that you can that new kinds of systems can be made, and that you don't necessarily need the same structure as traditional Unix or Windows operating system. And at the same time, it is, of course, the code tries to interact with the Raspberry Pi's hardware, and it's in that way also a bit of a documentation of the Raspberry Pi's hardware. I mean, I pulled together code from a lot of different people. For example, the USB stack is from the US Pi library that was floating around on the internet. I learned about the MMU from another person's code and adapted that for the memory management. And for many other parts, I basically brought together a lot of ideas that were already there. And this is a demonstration that you can write a totally new operating system for this computer. And also it can serve as a reference if people want to do their own bare metal stuff on the Raspberry Pi, they can browse in this source code and see, okay, how do you talk to the display? How do you configure the memory management? How do you configure the CPU? They can basically, everybody can now copy and paste this code out of this code base, because I just basically centralized all the bits and pieces that were flying around on the internet.
That was really the question I was going to ask you, Lukas, because the simplicity of the system you described is really appealing to myself, and say it's very reminiscent of the 8-bit computers we were talking about earlier. But surely what you're left with is something that is tied to a particular hardware platform. I mean, how do you deal with hardware abstraction? And isn't that abstraction a large degree of the complexity in other systems like Linux?
Yes, of course, the majority of code in, for example, Linux is device drivers. There's millions of lines of code that are in device drivers, and Linux really, I don't know if there's anything else that supports so much hardware. Okay, maybe NetBSD, but I try to focus on a few things, like keep it at a minimum. And I mean, Interim runs not only on the Raspberry Pi now, but it also works in a hosted environment. Like the whole operating system also works as an application that you can run on Linux or on OS X or on Windows or even on Amiga OS. I think the thing that makes it work in portable is that idea of using only a subset of the available operations in the CPU, for example. So I have a file for each processor that is, let me see, around 300 to 500 lines of code. And this is the JIT, for example, JIT M68K, the code generator for a given CPU. And if you want to port Interim to another CPU, you just have to implement this 500 lines of code that will generate the actual opcodes. And I use only a handful I don't use a lot of specific optimizations for a given machine, because I think, okay, of course you can always try to squeeze out the maximum performance, but in the system, for me, it's more important that it's simple and understandable, and the performance is reasonable. So you don't need to activate all of the bells and whistles that you have in your system.
That makes perfect sense. And if you were to do that, then you'd be forever chasing new features as hardware comes out, wouldn't you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So you talked about not having the resources to kind of push it to be a fully fledged operating system. Mm-hmm. Do you think that you could do that with enough resources, though? I mean, could you make something that has a full web browser, has multimedia capabilities, has the ability to program new applications on the platform?
Yes, I mean, it already has the ability. I'm sure not many people found this out, but there is actually a text editor included and you can write text files to your SD card. So you can actually program in Interim OS. It's not very comfortable, but it works. There is a limited TCP IP stack. You can connect to IRC with it. So yeah, it is really a matter of resource. Of course, it would be possible to make multimedia like video playback, audio playback, and web browsing possible. But you always have to restrain yourself a bit, because if you want to implement 100% of all standards, then you will get where we are now. Some things must be left out to make it as simple as possible. So, for example, you could say, what are the top 2 or 3 image formats that we really need? What are the 2 video formats that we really, really need? And, for example, I think we only need 1 text encoding, which is UTF-8. We only need 1 hypertext language, which is HTML5. But, especially the subject of browsers is really a complex one, because I have quite some experience with programming complex web applications and digging in like source code of Chromium, for example, and those are operating systems. Like browsers like Chrome and Firefox are operating systems in themselves, and it's really the question if that is necessary, or I would rather work to some kind of approach where the whole system is basically supports some kind of hypertext or web-like experience. But I don't want to drift too far off there. But so given enough resources, it would certainly be possible. Just the question is, do we need this? I'm not 100% sure. I think it would be cool to have a portable browser that, for example, supports at least the current encryption standards. But I think, for example, all the bells and whistles and CSS are not so important. I can give you an example why I think this is that way. In the last weeks, I restored some classic Amiga computers, and I think they are still, if you use an Amiga today, it still feels kind of snappy and fun, and you can bring it to the internet, no problem. You can bring them online. It's not very complicated to do that. But then you can download some kind of browser and go on Google, and you don't see most of the images, but it somehow works. You can get information, you can communicate, but it stops at that point where you go to an HTTPS website, like something that requires an encrypted connection, because crypto has really advanced a lot. And if you have an old platform, a simple platform, then this will be the hurdles, like encryptions and codecs basically are the really problematic things.
And JavaScript, presumably, as well.
Yes, I'm a big fan of, I don't follow the rule myself. With, for example, SpaceTech doesn't really work without JavaScript because it's a browser-based application. But I think it's good practice if you have a website that deals mostly with information or simple communication, then it should work without JavaScript.
But isn't that the issue, though, that even though it should work without JavaScript, almost no websites do work without JavaScript?
It's not true. I mean, it depends really what you want to do. For example, Google works perfectly fine without JavaScript or CSS. A lot of news sites or like just information sources, actually, even Tumblr works without JavaScript. It's not really that bad, actually.
Yeah, but surely you lose all the adverts, which is the point of half these sites.
Yes, definitely. So, yeah, I think it's really it's another problem, but this is another battle that has to be fought. But I think it's really, really bad idea to require a Turing-complete language to be executed in your computer to receive some kind of information of the internet. I think this is really not necessary. And it should be at all, there must be opposition against this.
I was just wondering, you've obviously done a lot to get to this position, and in everyone's heads you think that it's a fairly smooth transition, and people who do as much programming and coding and as knowledgeable as computers as yourself, it must have been a fairly easy path, but in reality it never is. I was just wondering, what was the biggest hurdle in getting to an Interim OS working on the Raspberry Pi?
Okay. The most problematic stuff was that at first it was incredibly slow. And I thought, this is impossible. Like, the first things you actually do, and I think, one of the most important things in a computer is the graphics frame buffer and getting some kind of display output, because computers are really very, very visual. Like, a personal computer is a very visual device. Really, the display is almost the most important thing. And I was, filling the screen. I was trying to get some kind of font in there and getting some text on the screen. And I made some tests, and I thought it's really slow. Like, I can see how the letters appear like one after another. What is wrong here? This is supposed to be like some kind of 900 megahertz machine or something, and it clearly doesn't look like this. And I didn't understand for a long time that what is really making this uninitialized system so slow at first is that I didn't turn on any caches. I forgot to turn on the instruction cache in the CPU. I forgot to turn on the level 2 cache. And later, I realized you also need to use the MMU, the memory management unit. And I didn't realize that the accesses to the actual RAM were so slow, because I come from, like, the last time I did really in-depth stuff was on 8-bit computers or even on microcontrollers. And they have something called SRAM, static RAM. And with static RAM, you usually can access it, write and read to it like in like a cycle or a few CPU cycles. And with the modern RAM that we have, the dynamic RAM, this is much, much, much slower. So basically the memory speed of our devices nowadays didn't keep up with the processing speed. And this disconnect wasn't clear to me until I experienced it basically in this bare metal environment. And I was very happy when I finally figured out how to make it fast. And then I really realized, okay, this is doable. But I really spent several weeks without understanding that I did this wrong. And was very enlightened later then.
Yeah, it must be very frustrating, especially as it's not really an area you can Google, given that this is a rare thing to be done. Just for my own knowledge and to sort of paint the picture for the listeners a little bit, you talk about the frame buffer, and you've talked about the fact you can have IRC and you can browse the web and things. It's clearly not just booting up to a command prompt. What sort of interface do you have with it?
It is actually booting up to a command prompt, but it is a graphical command prompt. So it is not, in the PC world, you have these two systems where you have the system called VGA, which is something that comes from the first PC and the BIOS, and it is basically this text mode. And on Raspberry Pi or on ARM computers in general, you don't have this text mode. So there's no hardware that would generate a fixed grid of letters on the screen. So if you configure the frame buffer, you just have the pixels, and then you have to care about how I draw the actual pixels of my text. But at the same time, you are very free. Like, you can instantly draw graphics, which is super cool because, for example, try that on your Linux desktop. Like, try setting a random pixel on the screen on and off. It's not so easy. You can do it if you have, if X11 is not running and you have a dev frame buffer device and stuff, but it's really not so easy as you think. And in the bare metal environment on the Raspberry Pi, it is much simpler. Once you communicate it with the graphics processor, it will give you an address in RAM, and you can just peek and poke like in the good old times, and you will have the pixels there. And everything in Interim is graphical. So the text is plotted as individual pixels, and that are copied obviously from a font bitmap, but you can also type a few commands and have lines and circles and stuff going on. And there's a little experimental program that you can launch that will activate your USB mouse. If you have connected it, then you will get a little mouse pointer, and there's a graphics pixeling program, for example. So it is all in the same environment. So there's not really a window manager yet, but there is definitely I would say it's a graphical terminal, maybe a bit like the early graphical terminals like the Blit or something like this.
We haven't really touched on sort of who this is aimed at. Is it just a little hobbyist thing for yourself, or is it for education? You know, where do you see this in the world of computing?
Yeah, so I got much more response to this project than I initially thought, and I'm very happy about that. Like, a lot of people have contacted me about it. They have filed issues. I got emails from people who wrote little programs in the Interim language, and people sent me code examples with improvements of the actual system and so on, and asked, okay, where can I help implement new types of numbers? For example, there's no floating point support and so on. I think the main target groups are people who want to go a bit deeper with the Raspberry Pi, because you can learn a lot of things about the Raspberry Pi from studying the source code, how I did some things. So it's very suitable for education. And I think if you have some resources, then you can definitely turn this into a useful embedded platform. You can use it as a real-time system with graphical and internet capabilities, stuff like that. Or you could prototype your own ideas in terms of computing operating systems on this, because it's really small and can be changed simply. And so I think it's very much aimed at education, at hobbyists, tinkerers, makers.
Okay. So if people want to find out more about Interim OS or how to get involved and help out, where's the best place for them to go and find out?
I think probably at interim-os.com. There is all kinds of links. There is the link to the GitHub, where there's source code and where you can basically follow the development and file issues that you have. There's now a development mailing list that is also linked to in the GitHub README. That's basically it. Yeah.
Okay, and also you've got a number of in-depth articles that you've written. Where can people find those?
Yeah, those articles are also linked in. Like, there's some bit more in-depth paper that I wrote that will be published in a book called Interface Critique near the end of the year, and you can already read this unpublished version of the paper also on the interim-os.com website.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for giving us your time. It's been a very fascinating chat, and hopefully speak to you again at some point.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I feel like we could have talked to Lukas all night, but it was kind of getting on there, so we had to wrap it up. But it's a very interesting project, Interim OS, and I think that it's got a lot of potential for the future. Hopefully other people will get involved with it.
I've got to say, it's the first Raspberry Pi project I've ever heard about that's actually made me think about going out and buying one to try it.
Aha, interesting. But with that then, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter, Google+, or Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again next week for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye all.
See you later.